Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I replace the CV boots on the front right side of my Volvo S40 2007. A while ago when I was changing the oil in my car, I noticed that there was a lot of grease around the inner CV boot. Like I usually do, the car was safely jacked up with jack stands and wheel chocks. First, I removed the engine splash shield to have an easy access to the CV axle assembly. With the wheel removed, it was easy to see that the grease was coming from a broken section of the inner CV boot. Because the outer CV boot was also old, I decided to replace this one at the same time. To speed up the work, I ordered right away the new CV boots from my local supplier. The retail part numbers selected by the part advisor were the same as the ones I found online. This being done, I began by loosening the bolt holding the CV joint shaft in the hub assembly. On most of the vehicles, I normally loosen the big axle nut with the wheel on the ground. But with this car, it is different. Volvo uses only a small bolt set to low torque. At this moment, I unscrewed it about half an inch and I pushed the CV shaft a bit inside the hub assembly to check if it was sliding easily. To be able to press down the lower control arm, the sway bar link kit had to be unfastened. To unfasten the link kit from the stud, first I loosened the nut with a wrench and I used an Allen bit socket to keep the ball stud stationary. To disconnect the link kit easily, I lifted the lower control arm until the ball stud was well aligned with the hole. Then the ball stud was pulled out and moved aside. Later, I loosened the 21mm nut holding the ball joint. As you can see, I used the second wrench to get more leverage. As soon as it was loose enough, I continued with a ratchet wrench. Note, when a ball joint nut is hard to turn, it is better to undo it while the ball joint is stuck in the knuckle bracket. When I was positioning the ball joint separator in place, I paid attention to make sure I would not damage the boot of the ball joint. The ball joint was firmly anchored in the knuckle bracket, and when the separator was compressing enough, the stud popped out. Just to let you know, usually I use my custom control arm tool with a removable U-hook that fits on the right or the left side. To press the lower control arm downwards and fully extract the ball joint, it is also possible to use a metal pipe, a clamp, and a piece of wood. Once free, I move the knuckle assembly beside the ball joint. To take out the outer shaft from the hub assembly, I removed the bolt completely and I pulled out the knuckle while I was handling the CV shaft on the other side. At that point, there was only the bearing of the intermediate shaft that was holding the CV axle assembly in place. The outer race of the bearing was held in place by a bearing carrier located on the engine block. To free the bearing, only two bolts and the carrier cap had to be removed. Then, after that, it was easy to pull out the intermediate shaft from the differential. I slowly maneuvered the assembly out and I placed it on the floor near the wheel well. In this view, I show the broken section of the inner boot from where the grease was coming out. There was no hole in the outer boot, but it was beginning to crack. To be well installed during the dismantling, I placed the CV axle assembly on the workbench. At this moment, it was better to start by removing the big clamp from the inner boot. Working this way, I was able to remove the boot and slide the tripod out of the CV housing. Since there was a lot of grease to wipe out and many components to clean, I prepared a lot of rags to go through the complete refurbishing. Because I planned to install the new boots by sliding them on the shaft from the tripod side, I cleaned this section first. To be able to slide out the tripod from the spline section of the shaft, first I removed the circlip. I could have used a brass punch to remove the tripod, but I used a medium-sized puller secured with locking chain pliers. At that point, there was no more restriction and I removed the inner boot easily. Therefore, it was time to remove the two clamps on the second boot. Once the clamps were discarded, the boot was retracted and completely removed from the shaft. It took me some time, but I cleaned the old boots to show their specific design. It was also useful to see clearly the interchange part numbers that could be used to order new parts. Note, whenever there are too many components to replace, like the outer CV joint, the tripod or the bearing, it is a good thing to check the price for a remanufactured assembly or a new one before wasting too much time on a project. When I got the new boot, the inner one was not matching at all, because the retail number of this boot was wrongly listed by the manufacturer. Finally, using the interchange part number embossed on the old inner boot, I looked online and it was easy to find the proper retail number. The two boot kits were provided with molybdenum grease and clamps. I took the time to add more grease and pack it properly in the cage. The other half of the grease was applied inside the boot. To refit the boot it was tricky to handle, but I was able to adjust it in place. Later on, I inserted the inner boot on the shaft, so the tripod could be reinstalled. Note, the tripod must be fitted on the shaft, with the bevel edge going first. It is also recommended to use a brass punch to refit the tripod in place. Volvo requires using a new circlip to lock the tripod. I also made sure the circlip was well inserted in the groove. It was not required, but I took the time to sand and repaint the intermediate shaft before the final assembly. The next morning the paint was dry and I began packing the tripod rollers with new grease. The rest of the grease was applied inside the tripod housing. When everything was ready, I inserted the tripod in the housing and I slowly pulled the boot over the housing. I made sure the edge of the boot was fitting in the groove. To tighten and secure the clamps in place, I used my airtight clamp pliers. Before reinstalling the CV axle assembly, I cleaned the bearing carrier components and I removed most of the grease that was spread on the parts all around the inner boot. To ease the fitting in the differential, I cleaned the splines at the end of the intermediate shaft. Soon after, I temporarily positioned the CV axle assembly. Following this step, I was able to begin the installation from under the car. First, I inserted the shaft into the differential. After that, with my other hand, I seated and held the bearing on the carrier base. I refitted the carrier cap and I fastened it with the two bolts. Later on, the torque was set to 18 foot-pounds. Once I was back beside the steering knuckle, I inserted the outer CV shaft into the hub assembly. I used one of my legs to press down the pipe that was attached to the lower control arm to gain more space while maneuvering the knuckle. A new bolt was also loosely fastened to hold the shaft in place. Soon after, the ball joint was refitted and the nut was tightened. Again, I had to lift the lower control arm. I reinstalled the sway bar link kit and the ABS wires. It is recommended to install a new nut when reinstalling the link kit. The torque was set to 37 foot-pounds. Since the ball joint nut was located in a tight space, I had to use my custom torque wrench adapter to set the torque to 52 foot-pounds. To properly tighten the CV axle bolt, I began with the step 1. The torque was set to 26 foot-pounds. After, I continued with the step 2. I tightened the bolt an extra 90 degrees. At the end, the wheel and the splash shield were reinstalled. Moments later, the car was tested and the CV axle performed normally. What really annoyed me with the inner CV boot was the wrong part number listed online. At least I solved the problem quickly by dealing with my local auto parts store, instead of getting the wrong part from online shipping.